Morning. It's wonderful to be with you here this morning. Glad that this is where you have chosen to be. If you have your Bibles, I pray that you do be opening this morning over to the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter number 4. That's where we're going to begin our sermon this morning. You know, we've been looking at a series of lessons dealing with, our first one was over God's three divine institutions. Last week we looked at a lesson entitled The State of the Union, but we really looked at the state of the church, specifically the state of the church here at Park Street. And then this morning, as we're looking at these series of lessons in preparation for the upcoming election, we're looking at a topic this morning entitled The Government. Our responsibility to it and its responsibility to us. Now, we have established, and I just want to refresh this in your mind, that the government is one of those divinely established institutions. God is the one that puts people in place as a government, and that brings us to Daniel chapter number 4. Daniel chapter number 4 is a very interesting chapter in the book of the Bible, but also within the book of Daniel itself, because the book, chapter number 4, is told from King Nebuchadnezzar's point of view. You notice there in Daniel chapter 4, verse number 1, it is actually King Nebuchadnezzar that is speaking in this chapter. Nebuchadnezzar is revealing a story, revealing something that happened to him. Specifically, he's going to reveal a lesson that happened to him. Now, I wish we had time this morning to deal with the entirety of chapter number 4 and the lesson in which Nebuchadnezzar has to learn. And ultimately, God saying, Nebuchadnezzar, you're not as powerful and as haughty as you think you are. A matter of fact, I'll show you just the type of you person are, Nebuchadnezzar. You're going to go over here and you're going to eat grass like a cow. And that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar does. Read the chapter. It'll be good study for you. But the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learns that is pertinent to our study this morning is found in verse number 17 of Daniel chapter number 4. The matter is by the decree of the watchers and demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know. So there's a lesson that the living, you and me, need to know. There's a lesson that King Nebuchadnezzar needed to know in this chapter. What's that lesson? That the Most High, that's God, ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomever he will, and setteth it up over the basest of men. In other words, when it comes to government, make no doubt about it, let there be no misunderstanding in your mind that God is in control. God is in control. And so our lesson this morning is really simple. 2 points. Point number 1, our responsibility as Christians to the government. Point number 2, the government's responsibility to me and you. And so let's get into it. Let's not waste any time. What is our responsibility to the government? I'm going to be honest with you. There's going to be 2 main passages that we go to this morning, really for the entirety of this sermon. So I don't know if you want to mark one and be prepared to flip back to the other, but we're going to be looking overall at 1 Peter chapter number 2, verses 13 to 17. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 17, and also Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. And so what we're going to do, we're going to read portions of each of these passages as we go through this morning. I want to start in 1 Peter chapter number 2, and I want to start there in verse number 13. Now, it's interesting really quickly before we even get to verse number 13, what it is that Peter is trying to do. If you back up to verse number 11, he says, Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. He's writing to Christians. We know this, 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse number 1. But he is telling these strangers, these pilgrims, that's you and I, because as we sometimes sing, this world is not my home. I'm just passing through. We'll deal more with that next week in a lesson entitled, Where is My citizenship. But the point that I want to focus on, Peter is bringing these attention. He goes on to verse number 12. He says, let your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may be your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Understand the word conversation there in chapter number 1 is conduct. Peter is saying, let the conduct of your life be honest. Let the conduct of your life be holy. Look at 1 Peter chapter number 1 and verse number 1. But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. It's the same word. Be ye holy in all manner of conduct. So we need to be honest. And we need to be holy in all things that we do. Add to that Colossians chapter 3 and verse number 17. For whatsoever you do in word or deed, do all in the name or according to Jesus Christ. Which means every word we say, every action we take, we need to make sure that we have the proper authority to do such a thing or to say such a thing. When it comes to our dealing with mankind, we need to be honest. We need to be holy, and that includes our relationship to the government. Look at verse number 13 of 1 Peter chapter number 2. It says, submit yourselves to, don't miss this word, it's an important word, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, for the praise of them that do well. Just a thought here really quickly before we go over to Romans 13, and then we'll start really adding some thoughts in. But notice this idea of every ordinance. And we're going to talk about the exception here in a minute, but for a moment, I want to focus in on this word, every. If you are going to do everything that somebody tells you to do, can you leave something out? You know, sometimes we use this illustration when we talk about the plan of salvation, right? You ever heard the plan of salvation compared to baking cookies? Maybe you're like, Zach, well, I've never heard that before. Well, let me give you an illustration. If you're set that you want to make chocolate chip cookies and you've got the recipe before you and it tells you that you need this much flour, this much sugar, this many eggs, vanilla, so on and so forth, what happens if you leave one of those things out? Friends, you don't have chocolate chip cookies. You could even leave something as simple as the chocolate chips out. You may still have cookies, but guess what? You don't have chocolate chip cookies. Leave the flour out and you got a big mess. What's the point? God says, here is the plan of salvation. This is what you have to do to hear, well done, thy good and faithful servant. What if I leave one of those things out? Guess what? I don't have salvation. Now, Peter's talking about the ordinances of man. He says, submit yourself to every ordinance of man. So any law that the government passes, we're going to talk about the exception. Don't get ahead of me. We're going to talk about it. But for right now, we're given the rule. You know, that's the way it is, right? There's the rule, and there's the exception to the rule. Good illustration for that. You go to a high school gymnasium. There might be a sign on the gymnasium door, and the sign will probably read something like this: no food or drinks in the gym. What's the rule? No food or drinks in the gym. But then under that same sign, there's probably the exception for the rule, except for basketball games. So if it's just a regular day, can I have food or drink in that gymnasium? The answer is no. But if it's a basketball game, can I now have food or drink in the gymnasium? The answer is yes. See, there are a rule, and then there is sometimes an exception to the rule. Now, there's not an exception to every rule, but sometimes there's an exception to the rule. A perfect example of this, not to go down this rabbit hole because we certainly don't have the time. You go over to Matthew chapter 19, and Jesus there sets the rule for marriage. And in the framing of that rule, divorce, and the one exception to be able to be remarried. And the only exception for remarriage, according to Matthew chapter 19, It's fornication. And someone may say, well, preacher, I don't like that. Don't argue with me. Argue with God. It's his rule. It's his rule. And so the rule here is to submit yourself to every ordinance. Now, it's not just every ordinance, but notice what it is. As to the king or unto governors. So here we have an example of your overall government and your local government. Friends, we have to submit not only to the rules that the President of the United States puts in place, but we also have to submit to the laws that the mayor of Olathe puts in place. You have the supreme ruler and the governors. Now, with some of this thought in mind, let's turn over to Romans chapter number 13, because I want to add Paul's thought. And you'll notice that Paul and Peter, they do not conflict in their discussion on the government and our responsibility to it. Let's just look at verse number 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained or appointed by God. And that word power there is also authority. So we have this idea here of being subject. We have this idea, the word subject is, I find this very interesting. The word subject in Romans 13 in verse number 1 is the exact same Greek word as submit in 2 Peter chapter 2 in verse number 13. It's the exact same Greek word. And so whether you want to look at it as submission, whether you want to look at it as be subject to, it's the same Greek word. Now, the Greek word is very interesting. The Greek word is actually a military term, which means to arrange in a military fashion under the command of a leader. That's the word that the Holy Spirit chose to use in the Christian's responsibility to the government. You arrange yourself under a leader. You willingly put yourself under a leader. Now, sometimes that leader is going to make rules that we don't like. Sometimes those rulers are going to make laws that we don't like. You know, a law that man has that I don't much care for? You're going to laugh at me when I say this. Speed limits. I hate speed limit signs. Why? Because sometimes you feel like you can go faster on a road. Like going down this road here, they got like 25 miles an hour. You could easily do 30 and it wouldn't hurt nothing. But what's the law? What's the ordinance? I may not like it. I may disagree with it. But if I'm going to submit myself to that government, guess what I'm going to do? Another one that people like to pick on. What about taxes? Right? The government says you got to pay your taxes every year. Here is his Uncle Sam. He's got his hand out and he says, "I want some of your money." What do we have to do? We have to give him that money. This is something that Jesus even said to do, right? Over in Mark chapter number 12 and verse number 17, you remember there were those that were coming and say, "Is it lawful for us to pay taxes unto Caesar?" And you remember what Jesus said? He said, "Give me one of those coins. Show me one of those coins. Whose image is on that coin?" "Well, it's Caesar's." He says, "Well, you need to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's." Now, don't miss the rest part of that. He says, "Render unto God the things that are God." Guess what? Even Jesus said, "Pay your taxes." You realize that we're being disobedient to God when we don't pay our taxes? We're being disobedient to God when we don't pay our taxes. Now, here's the thing. We talked about the rule. Now here's the exception to the rule. Because we clearly read in 1 Peter chapter number 2 that we are to submit to every ordinance. We're to be subject to the people that are in authority. Romans 13 chapter number 1. What if those people that are in authority, what if the government says, I'll give you a perfect example. And I don't mean to bring up hard feelings. I don't. It's just something that's fresh in our mind because it happened not too long ago. You remember 2020? Yeah, we all remember that year, right? And this virus that was going around. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that the virus was a hoax or anything like that. People got sick. People died. Don't misunderstand me. I realize that it was a serious thing. But you know, one of the things, there's actually two good examples here. You know, one of the things that the government did, they said, you know what? To protect people, we want everyone to wear a mask. I'll tell you right now, this guy right here did not like wearing masks. I hated it. I thought it was the dumbest thing because I could sneeze through that thing. And you know what would be in my hand? Snot. So what was that mask doing for me? Absolutely nothing. But you know what we did? We wore the mask. Here's why. Did wearing that mask prevent us from doing anything that God commanded me to do? The answer to that question is no. Wearing a mask on your face does not prevent you from doing anything that God tells you to do. Well, after the mask ordinance, there was another ordinance that the government put in. Remember that one? You can't assemble. You can't come together in groups larger than whatever the number was. See, now we have a problem. Now's where the exception to Romans 13:1 comes in. Now's the exception to where 2 Peter chapter number 2 and verse number 13 comes in. Now, the governing authorities have now put a law, an ordinance, a rule in place that contradicts the Word of God. Look over at Acts chapter number 5. Acts chapter number 5. I want you to note what Peter. Now, I find this very interesting because Peter is the one that writes in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse number 13 that you need to submit to every ordinance, whether it be of the king as supreme or the local government. You submit to it. But notice what that same man says in Acts chapter number 5 and verse number 29 when he says, then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man. So when the government says you can't assemble, that's when we as Christians have to respectfully, we're going to talk about respecting the government here in a minute. That's when we have to respectfully say to the government, we're going to assemble, regardless of what you say. The rule is we need to submit, be subject to the government, unless the government oversteps. And in 2020, the government of this land overstepped in that regard. They had no authority to tell me and you that we could not worship together. Now, I'm not trying to be political. I'm just going to leave that there. That just serves as a perfect example. The second thing that we need to do as far as the government is concerned, number one, we need to be subject to it. But number two, we need to respect it. If you're there, I'm in Acts, so I'm just going to go to Romans. We'll hit the Romans passage first this time. Romans chapter 13 and verse number 2. Romans chapter 13, verse number 2. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, the authority, the government, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resisteth shall receive to themselves damnation. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter number 2. Notice what Peter says on this subject. 1 Peter chapter number 2, look at verses 15 to 17. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, and what's that last one? Honor the king. So here's the thing, and I understand. Sometimes our government, let's be honest, sometimes our government does stupid things. They enact stupid and ungodly laws. Foolish and ungodly laws. But I have to respect them for who they are. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse number 17, the word honor there means to fix or find value in. Notice that. I find that interesting. To fix or to find value in. Sometimes we look at maybe the President of the United States, and I have to find value in that office because I'm commanded to. It also, that word honor there also carries the idea of showing great respect. Showing great respect. You know, I got to thinking about this, and, you know, the beautiful thing about having a godly wife is they sometimes give you ideas that you hadn't thought about. And Sarah told me, she's like, did you ever consider Joseph in your lesson for the government? I said I hadn't, but that's a good idea. And you look over at Genesis chapter number 41, and if you want the exact verse for your notes, we're not going to take time necessarily to go over there and read it, but you should. Look at Genesis chapter number 41 and verse number 14. Now, in the context, think about Joseph. He's been sold by his brothers. He's down in Egypt as a slave. He winds up in Potiphar's house, and because of this wicked woman, he ends up in jail. He was in prison, not for any crime that he had committed. Think about that. He's in prison. And he's in prison for 2 whole years. Now, if you were wrongly in prison for 2 whole years, would you probably have some ill will towards the people that put you in prison? Yeah, you probably would. That would have been the Egyptian government. They put Joseph in prison for no reason at all. Well, 2 years go by after he's sitting in prison, and here comes Pharaoh calling for Joseph. The reason why I bring up Genesis 41 and verse 14, Joseph comes out of prison, and you'll note there in that passage, he does not go directly before Pharaoh. He comes out of prison, and he cleans himself up. If anyone could have had ill will towards the government, it would have been Joseph. But he knew that he was going before the ruler of the land, and he's not going straight out of prison. No, he's going to clean himself up before he goes before the land. He respected the individual in whom he was going before. Now, Paul brings out in Romans chapter 13, verse number 2, that if we resist the government, if we don't show them the proper respect, if we set ourselves against them, then here's the thing, we set ourselves against God. Go back to Romans chapter number 13. Notice the language that Paul uses, because it's important language. It's important language what Paul uses here in verse number 2. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Verse number 5. For wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. Do you see what Paul is saying there? I'm gonna give an example. Right now, the current sitting president is Joe Biden. I may not like the party for which he runs for. I may not agree with some of the things that he has signed into law. I may not agree with the job that he has done. But you better believe, because of the office that he holds, I best respect him. And unless he signs a law into law, you get what I'm saying? A bill into law, there'd be the correct government term. Unless he signs a bill into law that goes against God's authority, guess what I have to do? I have to do it. So if tomorrow, just a silly example, if Joe Biden signed into law something that says every Tuesday you have to wear a pink hat. Guess what I'm doing every Tuesday? I'm wearing a pink hat. You can ask Sarah, I don't own a single stitch of pink clothing. But I'd be getting a pink hat. Be getting a pink hat. Because if I were to resist that, I'm resisting God. If I'm not subject to that, I'm subject, verse number 5, to the wrath of God. So let's fast forward here for just a moment. In November, we have a presidential election coming up. We got two main candidates, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump. I'm not going to stand here this morning and tell you who you should vote for. That's not my place. I want you to look at those individuals, look at the parties that they run for, and compare it to this book right here. That's what you need to know. But I can tell you that night, when they announce that either she has won the presidential election or he has won the presidential election, I, as a Christian, must accept it and respect it. Because that is my responsibility as a child of God to the government, to the office which God established. Really quickly, this last point, I don't have a whole lot on it. It's actually a really simple point. When I was writing this lesson, I'm like, man, I'm going to have to break this lesson into two parts. But this last point doesn't really have enough to really entail a whole lesson. So our responsibility in a nutshell, if I could sum it up to you, our responsibility to the government is to be in subjection to it and respect it. The exception, of course, is that they have a law that goes against God. And if I fail to do such a thing, then I receive damnation and become subject to the wrath of God. But since I have a responsibility to the government, I think it's important that we as Christians understand that it's not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. God established the government, and he has given the government a role, a responsibility to me and you. So sometimes when we have an opportunity to talk to our senator, instead of asking them if they'll lower our taxes, ask them if they're going to do what God said to do. Are you going to do what God said to do in the Bible as your role as a government official? Well, what is that role? Again, considering our two passages, I'm still in Romans chapter number 13, so we'll just start there. Romans chapter 13, look at verses 3 and 4. This is the role of the government, the responsibility of the government to me and you. For rulers, that's the government, that's the authority, are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Let's put with that 1 Peter chapter number 2, verses 14 to 16. 1 Peter chapter number 2, verses 14 to 16. Or unto governors as to them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men as free, not using your liberty for a cloak or malicious, but as the servants of God. And so here we have in this passage a twofold responsibility of the government to us, and it's really simple. Number one, to punish the evildoer. The government has a God-given responsibility to punish the evildoer. That's why you're going to think I'm crazy, but when someone runs down the highway at 80 miles an hour and the speed limit is 65 miles an hour, that's what gives that police officer the right to pull you over. Because he's punishing the evildoer. Now, that punishing may be as simply as a ticket that you have to go pay, but that punishment can sometimes be a whole lot worse. I'm gonna give you a political opinion, but it's not a political opinion. It's a biblical fact. So don't get mad at me. Get mad at God. Look at Romans chapter number 13 really quickly. Verse number 4, when talking about the government, and it says, he beareth not the sword in vain. Question, what's a sword used for? Be blunt, it's used to kill people. In other words, capital punishment is a biblical principle. So when the state of Kansas or Missouri or Texas or whatever it is slate to put someone to death, guess what? They had the God-given authority to do that. Because the government is not bearing the sword in vain. And so their first role to us is to punish the evildoer. And we see that God would use governments to punish people in the Old Testament. This is nothing uncommon. Look over at Ezekiel chapter number 21. I want to show you this because God used governments to punish people. Look over at Ezekiel chapter number 21, and we want to look specifically at verses 18 to 21. Ezekiel chapter 21, starting there in verse number 18. It says, "The word of the Lord coming to me, saying, As thou, son of man, appoint thee 2 ways, that the sword of the king of Babylon may come. Both twain shall come forth out of one land, and choose thou a place. Choose it at the head of the way to a city. Appoint a way that the sword may come to Rabbah of the Amorites, and to Judah in Jerusalem the defense." Do you see what the prophet has been told? Ezekiel, Nebuchadnezzar is coming. He's coming as my sword of judgment, and he's coming against the Amorites, and he's coming against Jerusalem, my people. So there you have an instance where God used a government, the Babylonians, to punish people that were doing wicked. The other thing that the government does, the God-given role for the government, is to reward the righteous. That's what Paul brings out in Romans 13. That's what Peter brings out there in 1 Peter chapter number 2. That not only is the government going to punish the evildoer, but they are to reward the righteous. Ask your congressman next time you send him a letter, when's the last time that they recognized those that were doing right? You don't hear about that too often, do you? But that's a God-given role. God has used governments to help the righteous. Look over at Acts chapter number 23. Acts chapter number 23, there's an interesting event that takes place here in Acts chapter number 23. And for time's sake, we're just going to start reading in verse number 23. It says, "And he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200 at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide them beasts, that they may set Paul on, and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter after this manner: Claudius Lysias unto the most excellent governor Felix sendeth greeting. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then I came with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman." Here is the Roman government helping a citizen. He wasn't doing evil, so therefore he must have been doing good. Here Paul is getting ready to be killed for teaching the gospel by the Jews, and the Romans step in and say, you're not killing this Roman citizen. And notice they came to Paul's aid with a whole army. I want to make this one last point really quickly, and the lesson will be yours. We have to understand in this entire conversation, when we talk about the government, when we talk about Christians, we have to remember that it is men that occupy those roles. And so when we get into the government, you may have an individual that is placed there. And don't misunderstand it. The Bible says that that person is there because God placed them there. But just because God places you in a position doesn't mean you're going to take advantage of it. On Wednesday evening, for those that are in my Wednesday night Bible class, we're in Isaiah chapter number 5. The first 6 verses of Isaiah chapter number 5 is about the vineyard that God planted. And God said, I did everything for this vineyard. I hedged it. I weeded it. It had the best soil. It had the best seed. And yet it brought forth wild grapes. Sometimes you can do everything you need to do. And sometimes people make their own choices and they make bad choices. So sometimes you get people that are put into government and they don't do what God said they should do. Sometimes you get Christians that don't do what God said to do as far as the government is concerned. Now I bring that point out to point out this. God has given the roles. We need to fulfill those roles. And if we fail, either as a Christian responding to the government or the government responding to the people, God will punish those individuals. One last verse. Look over at Isaiah chapter number 13. We looked in Ezekiel and we showed that God had chosen Nebuchadnezzar, that God had chosen Babylon to punish his people. When you get over to Isaiah chapter number 13, though, you find something very interesting here. Verse number 1 indicates the burden of who? Babylon, which Isaiah, the son of Amos, did see. Move on down to verse number 17, and you're going to see why this burden is here and what's going on. It says, Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, which shall not regard silver, as for gold, and they shall not delight in it. Their bows also shall dash the young men to pieces, and they shall have no pity on the fruit of their womb. Their eye shall not spare children, and Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, and the beauty of the Chaldeans, excellently shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because God took Babylon. He said, Babylon, I'm going to use you as my rod of judgment against Jerusalem. This is what you need to do. Babylon not only punished God's people, but they were cruel to them. They were excessive. They did not follow the commands of God. So here in Isaiah chapter number 13, verse 17 through 22, we see that the Babylonians, the government in which God used to overthrow, are now going to be overthrown. When you go back, you don't have to go back there this evening, but if you go back to Daniel chapter number 4, where we started this lesson, Nebuchadnezzar is wanting the world to know that the Most High is ruleth and is active in the kingdoms of men. He puts the people in place that he wants. But in that same chapter, Nebuchadnezzar was in authority and power. He was there because God wanted him. But in that same chapter, Nebuchadnezzar is removed from that authoritative position because Nebuchadnezzar did not do what he was supposed to do. And so our responsibility as Christians to the government is to respect it and to submit to it. And if I fail to do that, I'm resisting God and I will be punished accordingly. The government is supposed to punish the evildoer and to reward the righteous. If the government fails to do that, it too will be held accountable by God. And so we sometimes look at governments around the world and we see dictators that come to power and the wicked things that they do. And we sit back and we go, how could God place them in power? God placed them in power because he needed them to do something. But understand, God will take care of their wickedness. Just as well as God will take care of our rebellion if we choose such a path. I know that our lesson this morning has not been one of evangelistic nature. But we want to make sure anytime that we come together that we take the opportunity to extend into you the Lord's invitation. So if you're here this morning and you are outside the body of Christ, we would encourage you to do those things to become a child of God this morning. The water is ready. We're here to take care of that need if there is one. Maybe you're here this morning as a child of God, and maybe you're guilty of these things that we've talked about this morning. Not respecting, not being in subjection to the God-given government. Remember, there is that exception. Don't forget that exception. But if that's you, if you're outside looking into the kingdom, choose this morning to become part of that kingdom, to rejoin that kingdom. If there's anyone that needs to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come. Together we stand and we sing.